In 1983, a 14-year-old boy named Thomas walked into the American embassy in Bangkok with a photograph of a man he had never met. The photograph was the only thing his Vietnamese mother had kept from the years before the fall of Saigon. The man in the photograph was American. Thomas did not know his name. He did not know what state he was from or whether he was alive or dead. He knew only that the man in the photograph was his father, and that his existence as the son of an American soldier had made his life in Vietnam something close to unlivable. He had been denied school enrollment. He had been denied work. Vietnamese children had beaten him in the streets with the specific casual cruelty reserved for people a society has decided do not fully belong to it. His mother called him by the name Vietnamese society had given to children like him, bụi đời, the dust of life. Thomas was one of an estimated 25,000 to 100,000 children born to American fathers and Vietnamese mothers during the Vietnam War, and his story, unremarkable in its broad outlines among the community of Amerasian children, is one of the most sustained and least examined human consequences of the American presence in Southeast Asia. The children who came to be called Amerasians were the product of a war that had brought 500,000 American soldiers into sustained contact with a civilian population under conditions of profound inequality. Some were born of relationships that, by the accounts of those involved, were genuine and caring. Some were born of arrangements that were transactional and brief. Some were born of violence. The circumstances of their conception covered the full spectrum of what happens when a heavily armed foreign military occupies a country for a decade, and the children themselves bore no responsibility for any of it. What they bore was the consequence. During the war, their existence was uncomfortable but manageable within the South Vietnamese social context. A mixed-race child was evidence of something that Vietnamese families often preferred not to discuss, but the American presence was so pervasive that the evidence was everywhere. In Saigon, in Da Nang, in the provincial towns near major American installations, Amerasian children were a visible feature of the landscape. Their American fathers were, in many cases, still present or recently departed. The social order that would have condemned the children outright had not yet fully organized itself, because the war was ongoing and the social order was itself unstable. April 30th, 1975 changed everything. The fall of Saigon brought a government to power that viewed Amerasian children as the most literal possible symbol of American imperialism, which is to say it viewed them as enemies of the state in the bodies of children. The new government did not pass a law persecuting Amerasians. It did not need to. It simply allowed Vietnamese society to do what societies do to people they have been given permission to treat as outcasts. Amerasian children were denied enrollment in public schools. Their mothers, if they had worked in any capacity connected to Americans, were subjected to re-education. The children were denied work permits as they aged into adolescence. They were denied housing priority. They were beaten by other children and ignored by authorities when they reported it. Black Amerasians, the children of African American soldiers, faced a compounded hostility that reflected both the new government's ideology and the racial prejudices already present in Vietnamese society. They were the most visible, the most obviously foreign, and the most brutally treated. The United States government's response to the situation it had helped create was captured in a single sentence from a 1970 Department of Defense statement that has been quoted in subsequent scholarship with the precision of a document that reveals something essential. The statement declared that the care and welfare of these unfortunate children has never been and is not now considered an area of government responsibility. The statement was issued in 1970, 5 years before the fall of Saigon. It was a policy declaration made while American soldiers were still in Vietnam producing the children the policy was declining to acknowledge. The word unfortunate was not redacted or apologized for. It was the characterization a government chose for children produced by its own military presence, and it stood for 17 years before Congress finally acted. The Amerasian Homecoming Act of 1987 was the result of years of advocacy by refugee organizations, journalists who had documented conditions in Vietnam, and the children themselves, some of whom had by then reached adulthood and found ways to make their cases heard. The act allowed Amerasians and their immediate family members to immigrate to the United States based on their appearance. No DNA test, no proof of paternity. A child who looked sufficiently American could apply for immigration. The provision was practical. DNA testing was not then what it is now, and it was also an acknowledgement, never stated directly in the legislative language, that the government had an obligation it had been refusing to meet for 17 years. The implementation of the Homecoming Act produced outcomes that were more complicated than the legislation's supporters had anticipated. Between 1988 and 2009, approximately 25,000 Amerasians and 60 to 70,000 of their family members were admitted to the United States. The approval rate was 95%. The numbers looked like success. What they concealed was a secondary crisis that developed almost immediately and that the State Department had not adequately prepared for. Amerasians who had been rejected by their Vietnamese families for years, beaten and denied and called dust of life, suddenly found themselves valuable. They were tickets to America. Vietnamese families who had refused to claim them for a decade now appeared with documentation of relationships that in many cases were fraudulent. An estimated 17% of the family members admitted alongside Amerasians were later found to have no genuine family relationship to them. The children who had been abandoned by Vietnamese society were now being used by it. The resettlement experience in the United States replicated, in different form, many of the difficulties the children had experienced in Vietnam. Most arrived speaking little or no English. Most had received limited formal education due to the systematic exclusion from Vietnamese schools. Many had psychological damage from years of rejection and violence that no resettlement program was equipped to address. They arrived in American cities, Los Angeles, Houston, New Orleans, Minneapolis, and encountered a social service system that had been designed for Vietnamese refugees generally and had not specifically anticipated the needs of young adults who had grown up as stateless outcasts and now found themselves in a country whose language they did not speak, but whose blood they carried. The search for fathers became one of the defining experiences of Amerasian adulthood in the United States. Some had photographs, some had names, some had nothing beyond a general physical resemblance to someone who had passed through their mother's life during the war and left no forwarding address. Organizations dedicated to connecting Amerasians with their biological fathers emerged in the 1990s and 2000s. DNA testing, as it became more accessible and affordable, opened possibilities that had not previously existed. Some reunions happened. A man in his 40s meeting a father who had spent decades not knowing he existed, or knowing and choosing not to look, was not a simple event. The reunions that happened were frequently complicated by time, by the gap in experience, by the question of what acknowledgement at this late stage was actually worth. The ones that did not happen were more common. Only an estimated 30% of Amerasians who sought their biological fathers ever made successful contact. The remaining 70% received no answer, or a denial, or a letter that expressed regret without accepting responsibility. Some fathers had died. Some had built lives with American families who did not know about what had happened in Vietnam. Some had simply made the calculation, available to them in a way that was not available to their children, that the past did not require acknowledgement. Le Van Minh was born in 1968 in Saigon. His father was an American serviceman whose name his mother knew but would not give him, for reasons she never fully explained. Minh grew up in Ho Chi Minh City after 1975, denied school above the primary level, working as a street vendor from the age of 12. He immigrated to the United States in 1991 under the Homecoming Act, arriving in California at the age of 23 with no English, no education beyond 6th grade, no family connection in the country he was told was partly his. He spent years in ESL programs and job training and the specific kind of starting over that people in their mid-20s do not anticipate doing when they imagine their lives. He found his father's name through a veterans organization in 2003. His father had died in 1999. He had a half-sibling in Ohio who did not know he existed. The half-sibling did not respond to his letter. The Amerasian children of Vietnam are in their 50s now. They are among us in the United States, in numbers that the government's own statistics can partially but not completely account for. Some have built lives that bear the specific mark of people who survived something that should not have happened to them and found ways to go forward anyway. Some have not. The 1970 Department of Defense statement that declared their welfare not an area of government responsibility was never formally rescinded. It was superseded by the Homecoming Act, which addressed the immigration question without addressing the 17 years between the statement and the legislation or the specific harm that those 17 years had produced. The dust of life. That is what Vietnamese society called them. The phrase is poetic in a way that the people who used it as an insult probably did not intend. Dust settles everywhere. It covers everything eventually. It does not go away simply because the wind that carried it has stopped blowing. There is a video on screen right now about the other human consequences of the Vietnam War that the official history has difficulty looking at directly. Subscribe. The stories that start with a government statement declining responsibility are usually the ones that most need telling.